The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I stood in the corner of the Metropolitan Ballroom, watching the city's tech elite congratulate each other on achievements I'd helped build but would never receive credit for. The annual Innovation Gala, they called it. More like an annual reminder of exactly where I stood in Silicon Valley's hierarchy. My name is Sarah Chen, and 3 years ago, I was the invisible programmer behind some of the biggest breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. While venture capitalists in $1,000 suits shook hands over deals worth millions, I debugged their code at 3 in the morning, fixed their security vulnerabilities, and built the algorithms that would eventually make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. But that night, as I watched my former boss Marcus Wellington take the stage to accept the Innovator of the Year award for software I'd written, something inside me snapped. The polite applause echoed through the ballroom as he delivered his acceptance speech, taking credit for 18 months of my life's work without mentioning my name once. The worst part wasn't even the stolen credit. It was what happened next. During the networking hour, I approached Marcus near the dessert table, thinking maybe this was finally my chance to remind him of my contributions. The conversation started innocently enough. I congratulated him on the award, mentioned how proud I was to have worked on the project. His response still haunts my dreams. He looked at me with this condescending smile, the kind reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. Then he laughed, before turning to his circle of investors and saying loud enough for half the room to hear, "This is Sarah, one of our junior developers. She thinks she built the whole system herself." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly, but it was dismissive. Casual. Like swatting away a fly that had momentarily annoyed you. One of the investors, a woman in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, patted my shoulder and said, "That's sweet, honey. Keep working hard and maybe someday you'll understand how real innovation works." I stood there, frozen, as they continued their conversation about market disruption and scalability, completely forgetting I existed. The humiliation burned through me like acid, but something else grew alongside it. Something harder. Something that would change everything. That night, I made a decision that would transform not just my career, but my entire understanding of what I was capable of achieving. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something about the tech industry. Success isn't just about writing good code or having brilliant ideas. It's about perception, about who gets invited to the right meetings, whose name appears on the patents, who gets remembered when awards are handed out. For 5 years, I'd been the ghost in the machine, the person who made things work while other people took the credit. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that the work was reward enough. But watching Marcus accept that award, listening to him describe my innovations as if they'd sprung fully formed from his own genius, I realized I'd been lying to myself. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, and I wasn't part of it, so I decided to build my own. The morning after the gala, I walked into Marcus's office and quit. Not with a dramatic speech or a folder full of evidence about stolen intellectual property, just a simple 2-week notice, professional and clean. He barely looked up from his computer screen when I placed the letter on his desk. "Good luck finding something that matches your skill level," he said without looking at me. The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that I almost felt sorry for him. He had no idea what was coming. Those 2 weeks became the most productive period of my professional life. While I finished my remaining assignments during the day, I spent every evening and weekend building something new. Not just software, but a complete framework for artificial intelligence that would make everything I'd created at Marcus's company look like a child's toy. The difference was approach. While everyone else in Silicon Valley was focused on incremental improvements to existing systems, I was rethinking the fundamental architecture of machine learning. Instead of teaching computers to mimic human thinking patterns, I was developing algorithms that could evolve their own logic structures. It sounds technical, and honestly, it was. But the practical applications were revolutionary. Imagine AI that doesn't just follow programmed responses, but actually develops new ways of solving problems you never anticipated. Imagine systems that become more creative and intuitive over time, not just more efficient. I called it adaptive neural evolution, and it worked. The first prototype took me 4 months to complete, working alone in my studio apartment with 3 monitors and a determination that bordered on obsession. I tested it on pattern recognition problems that had stumped entire research teams. It solved them in hours. But here's the thing about breakthrough technology. It's worthless unless you can prove it works in the real world. So I started small, reaching out to companies that were too young or too desperate to care about my lack of credentials. Startups that needed solutions more than they needed prestige. My first client was a logistics company struggling with supply chain optimization. Their system was hemorrhaging money because it couldn't adapt to changing conditions fast enough. Traditional I would require months of retraining every time shipping routes changed or demand patterns shifted. My system learned and adapted in real time. Within 3 weeks, I'd reduced their operational costs by 37% while improving delivery times by nearly half. The CEO, a former Goldman Sachs analyst named David Park, called me into his office after reviewing the results. "I don't understand how this is possible," he said, staring at the performance metrics on his screen. "We've been working with AI consultants from Stanford and MIT. Their best projections had us maybe achieving half these improvements over a full year." I explained the basic principles of adaptive neural evolution, watching his expression shift from confusion to excitement to something approaching awe. By the end of our meeting, he'd not only paid my full consulting fee, but offered to invest in whatever I built next. That's when I realized I wasn't just building better software. I was building proof. Over the next 8 months, I took on 6 more clients. Each project pushed the boundaries of what my system could accomplish. A financial services firm that wanted to predict market volatility, a healthcare startup developing diagnostic tools, a renewable energy company optimizing power grid distribution. Every single project exceeded expectations by margins that seemed almost impossible. My client list grew through word-of-mouth recommendations from executives who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing but couldn't argue with the results. The technology press started paying attention. First, a mention in TechCrunch about the mysterious AI consultant producing remarkable results for small companies. Then a deeper investigation in Wired that tried to understand how someone without an advanced degree or Silicon Valley connections was outperforming teams from Google and Facebook. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Elizabeth Morrison reached out to me. Dr. Morrison was the director of artificial intelligence research at Carnegie Mellon University, one of the most respected voices in the field. She'd read about my work in academic circles and wanted to understand the theoretical foundations of my approach. We spent 3 hours on a video call, diving deep into the mathematical principles underlying adaptive neural evolution. She asked probing questions about neural plasticity, evolutionary algorithms, and computational complexity that would have intimidated me a year earlier. Instead, I found myself explaining concepts that I'd developed through intuition and experimentation, watching her realize that I wasn't just applying existing techniques in clever ways. I was pioneering an entirely new branch of artificial intelligence. At the end of our conversation, she leaned back in her chair and shook her head slowly. "Sarah," she said, "what you've developed here isn't just an improvement on current AI systems. It's a paradigm shift. This could change everything." 3 weeks later, she invited me to present my research at the International Conference on Machine Learning in Vienna. Not as a vendor or a consultant, but as a keynote speaker. The same conference where Marcus Wellington had been invited to present his work. The work I'd actually built. As I hung up the phone after accepting Dr. Morrison's invitation, I thought about that night at the Metropolitan Ballroom. About Marcus laughing at my contributions. About the investor who told me to keep working hard until I understood real innovation. In 6 months, I'd be standing on a stage in front of 3,000 of the world's leading AI researchers, presenting discoveries that would reshape their entire field. And Marcus would be sitting in the audience, watching me receive the recognition that should have been mine all along. But revenge wasn't really the point anymore. Somewhere between those late nights of coding and the satisfaction of solving impossible problems, I'd discovered something more valuable than vindication. I'd found my voice. The months leading up to Vienna became a whirlwind of preparation and validation. Research institutions started reaching out, wanting to understand my methodology. Tech journalists requested interviews about the unknown programmer who was quietly revolutionizing artificial intelligence. Each conversation reinforced the same realization that had been growing since I quit Marcus's company. I hadn't just been underestimated, I'd been underestimating myself. But the real test was still ahead. Because presenting groundbreaking research to academics was one thing. Facing the people who'd dismissed me, proving that their casual cruelty had been directed at someone they should have been learning from instead, that was something else entirely. The invitation to Vienna arrived on official letterhead, embossed with the conference logo that represented the pinnacle of artificial intelligence research. As I held the paper in my hands, I couldn't help but remember another piece of mail I'd received just 2 years earlier. A rejection letter from the same conference, politely declining my application to present a poster session on neural network optimization. Back then, I was still Sarah Chen, junior developer. Now, I was being invited as the opening keynote speaker. The irony wasn't lost on me, but something had shifted in how I processed these moments. The burning need for validation that had once consumed me had transformed into something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. Confidence built on evidence rather than hope. My consulting practice had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible. What started as desperate outreach to struggling startups had evolved into a selective client list that read like a who's who of forward-thinking companies. The CEO of a Fortune 500 manufacturing giant had flown to my city just to spend 2 hours understanding how adaptive neural evolution could revolutionize their production processes. But it wasn't the money or the recognition that drove me anymore. It was the problems themselves. Each new challenge revealed another layer of what my system could accomplish, pushing me to develop capabilities I hadn't even known were possible. The breakthrough that would define my Vienna presentation came from an unexpected source. A small agricultural research facility in Iowa had approached me about optimizing crop yields using weather pattern analysis. Traditional AI models could process historical data and make predictions based on established patterns. But they failed catastrophically when climate conditions deviated from historical norms. My system didn't just adapt to unexpected weather patterns. It began identifying subtle environmental indicators that human researchers had never considered relevant. Soil microbe activity levels, electromagnetic field fluctuations, even the migration patterns of certain bird species. Within 6 months, it was predicting crop yields with 94% accuracy, even during the most unpredictable growing season in decades. The implications staggered me. This wasn't just better pattern recognition. The system was developing its own understanding of causality, finding connections that existed beyond human comprehension. It was thinking in ways we'd never taught it to think. Dr. Morrison called it the emergence of genuine artificial intuition. The academic paper we co-authored describing these developments sent shockwaves through the research community. Within weeks, I was fielding calls from universities across 3 continents, all wanting to understand how a former corporate programmer had achieved what their entire departments had been struggling toward for decades. The attention was intoxicating, but it also brought unexpected challenges. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know my story. How had I developed these innovations in isolation? What was my educational background? Who were my mentors? The questions made me uncomfortable because they revealed assumptions about how breakthrough discoveries were supposed to happen. The questioners expected tales of prestigious PhD programs, research grants, collaboration with established experts. Instead, they got stories of debugging code at 3 a.m. and teaching myself advanced mathematics through online courses. Some people struggled to accept that transformative innovation could emerge from such humble circumstances. I began to understand that my success threatened certain comfortable beliefs about how the technology world operated. But the most difficult conversation came from an unexpected source. Marcus Wellington called me on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 6 weeks before the Vienna conference. I almost didn't answer when his name appeared on my caller ID, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice sounded different than I remembered. Less assured, somehow smaller. "Sarah," he began, then paused as if unsure how to continue. "I've been following your work. The agricultural project, the financial services applications. It's impressive." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. "I wanted to discuss a potential collaboration," he continued. "My company has resources, connections, infrastructure. You have this remarkable technology. Perhaps we could find a way to work together again. The audacity of it struck me speechless for a moment. Here was the man who had stolen credit for my work, who had publicly dismissed me as a junior developer with delusions of grandeur, now calling to propose a partnership as if we were equals. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "A licensing agreement. We would handle the business development, the scaling, the market positioning. You would continue the research and development. We both benefit from our respective strengths." I found myself thinking about the Sarah who had stood in that ballroom 3 years earlier, desperate for recognition, willing to accept scraps of credit for work that was entirely her own. That Sarah might have been tempted by his offer, grateful for the validation of his attention, but that Sarah no longer existed. "Marcus," I said carefully, "I appreciate your interest, but I'm not looking for partners right now. I'm focused on the Vienna presentation and the research that will follow." "Vienna?" His voice sharpened with interest. "You're presenting at the international conference?" "Keynote speaker," I said simply. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Congratulations," he finally said, and I could hear the effort it took him to sound genuine. "That's quite an achievement." After we hung up, I sat in my office staring out at the city skyline, processing the conversation. 3 years ago, his recognition would have meant everything to me. Now, it felt like an echo from a life I'd outgrown. The real validation came from sources that mattered more. Dr. Morrison had introduced me to a network of researchers who viewed my work not as a curiosity, but as the foundation for the next generation of artificial intelligence. Graduate students were beginning to reference my papers in their dissertations. Companies were restructuring their AI strategies around principles I'd developed. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected email I received 2 weeks before leaving for Vienna. It was from a young programmer named Lisa Huang, who worked at a tech startup in Seattle. She'd read about my journey in a magazine profile and wanted to thank me for proving that breakthrough innovation could come from anywhere. "I've been the only woman on my development team for 2 years," she wrote. "My ideas get dismissed regularly, and my contributions are often credited to my male colleagues. Reading about your success has given me the courage to start building my own solution to the problems I see every day. If you could transform your frustration into revolutionary technology, maybe I can too." I stared at that email for a long time, realizing that my story had become bigger than my personal vindication. It had become proof of possibility for people who felt invisible in their own professional lives. The week before Vienna, I received the conference program in the mail. There was my name, printed in bold letters above the keynote session title: Adaptive Neural Evolution and the Future of Artificial Intelligence. Below it, my photograph and a brief biography that described me as one of the most innovative AI researchers of her generation. On page 17, I found Marcus Wellington's name listed as a presenter in Session C, discussing incremental improvements in machine learning applications. The contrast wasn't lost on me. He would be presenting to a half-empty conference room about marginal optimizations to existing systems, while I would be addressing the entire conference about technology that could reshape their field. But as I packed my suitcase for the trip to Vienna, I realized that the outcome mattered less than the journey itself. Somewhere between that humiliating night at the Gala and this moment of professional triumph, I had discovered something more valuable than revenge. I had discovered who I was capable of becoming when I stopped waiting for permission to excel. The flight to Vienna gave me 12 hours to reflect on the presentation I would deliver in 48 hours. The speech I'd prepared wasn't just about adaptive neural evolution or the technical breakthroughs I'd achieved. It was about the power of persistent curiosity, about finding innovation in unexpected places, about the importance of believing in your own vision even when the entire world seems to dismiss it. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, carrying me toward a moment I'd dreamed about for 3 years, I thought about that young woman who had stood trembling in the corner of the Metropolitan Ballroom, watching other people receive credit for her work. She had no idea what she was capable of achieving. But she was about to find out. The Vienna International Conference Center rose before me like a monument to human achievement, its glass facades reflecting the morning sun as hundreds of researchers streamed through the entrance. I adjusted my blazer, feeling the weight of the presentation slides in my bag, and took a deep breath of the crisp Austrian air. 3 years of work had led to this moment, but I wasn't nervous anymore. The anxiety that had once consumed me before important meetings had been replaced by something steadier. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing your work can speak for itself. Inside, the conference buzzed with conversations in a dozen languages. Professors from MIT rubbed shoulders with researchers from Tokyo University. Corporate executives exchanged business cards with graduate students. This was the epicenter of artificial intelligence research, and somehow, impossibly, I belonged here. Dr. Morrison found me near the registration desk, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Sarah, you made it. How was the flight?" "Long but productive," I replied, returning her smile. "I spent most of it refining the demonstration sequences." "Excellent. I've been fielding questions about your presentation all morning. The anticipation is remarkable." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I've never seen this level of pre-conference buzz around a keynote. People are genuinely excited to understand what you've accomplished." As we walked toward the main auditorium for the opening ceremonies, I caught glimpses of familiar faces from the technology press. Journalists who had written about my work, researchers who had cited my papers, executives whose companies had benefited from my consulting. The recognition felt surreal, like watching my professional life reflected back at me from a funhouse mirror. But it was the conversation I overheard near the coffee station that really drove home how much had changed. Two researchers were discussing the conference schedule, debating which sessions to attend. One of them mentioned my keynote, and his colleague responded with excitement I could hear from across the room. "Chen's work is absolutely revolutionary," he said. "If her Vienna presentation lives up to the hype, we might be witnessing the birth of an entirely new field of study." "Have you actually tested her algorithms?" the first researcher asked. "My lab ran simulations based on her published methodology last month. The results were unlike anything we'd seen before. The system didn't just learn from our data, it began generating insights that our human researchers hadn't considered." I moved away before they could notice me eavesdropping, but their words echoed in my mind as I prepared for the afternoon's events. This wasn't just about personal vindication anymore. The work I'd developed in isolation was genuinely advancing human knowledge. The realization should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like coming home. That evening, the conference hosted its traditional welcome reception in the hotel ballroom. Unlike the Metropolitan Ballroom where my journey had begun, this gathering felt warm and inclusive. Conversations focused on shared challenges, collaborative possibilities, the excitement of pushing boundaries together. I found myself surrounded by small groups of researchers, each drawn by curiosity about my unconventional path to breakthrough innovation. Their questions weren't dismissive or condescending. They wanted to understand, to learn, to explore how my discoveries might inform their own work. A young postdoctoral researcher from Cambridge approached me during a lull in conversation. Her name was Dr. Amanda Foster, and she'd been struggling with optimization problems that traditional AI couldn't solve. "Your agricultural project has become legendary in our department," she said, eyes bright with enthusiasm. The idea that AI could develop its own causal reasoning, that it could find patterns beyond human comprehension, it's exactly what we've been hoping was possible. "What problems are you working on?" I asked, genuinely interested. She described her research into climate modeling, specifically the challenge of predicting environmental changes when so many variables interacted in ways scientists didn't fully understand. Traditional models could process known relationships, but they failed when unexpected factors emerged. As she talked, I found myself sketching potential applications of adaptive neural evolution on a cocktail napkin. The system's ability to develop its own logical frameworks could be transformative for climate research, allowing models to discover connections that human scientists hadn't yet identified. "This could work," I said, showing her the rough framework I'd outlined. The system wouldn't just process your existing climate data, it could begin identifying environmental indicators you haven't considered relevant. Dr. Foster stared at the napkin like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Would you be willing to collaborate? Our department has been allocated significant computational resources for the next research cycle. Send me your data parameters after the conference," I replied. "Let's see what we can discover together." The conversation reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with programming in the first place. Not the recognition or the financial rewards, but the pure joy of solving puzzles that mattered. The satisfaction of building something that could make the world measurably better. As the reception wound down, I noticed a familiar figure near the bar. Marcus Wellington stood alone, nursing a drink and checking his phone with the distracted air of someone who felt out of place. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked over, his expression carefully neutral. "Sarah," he said, extending his hand. "Congratulations on the Keynote slot. It's quite an honor." I shook his hand, studying his face for traces of the condescension I remembered so clearly. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine respect, mixed with what might have been regret. "Thank you," I replied simply. "I've been following your work," he continued. "The applications you've developed, the theoretical framework, it's impressive. More than impressive, actually. It's groundbreaking." The admission hung between us, heavy with implications. This was as close to an apology as I was likely to receive, and surprisingly, I found I didn't need more. "How's your presentation going?" I asked. He smiled ruefully. "Session C, Room 12. Discussing incremental improvements to existing algorithms, not exactly setting the world on fire." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I think I may have underestimated what you were capable of achieving." "People change," I said. "Work evolves. What matters is what we build next." After he walked away, I realized the conversation had felt like closing a chapter rather than winning an argument. The anger I'd carried for 3 years had transformed into something more useful, understanding of how systems worked, and more importantly, how to build better ones. The next morning arrived with crystalline clarity. My keynote was scheduled for 10 o'clock, allowing time for the auditorium to fill with the conference's full attendance. As I reviewed my presentation slides one final time, I felt the familiar calm that preceded my best work. Dr. Morrison knocked on my hotel room door at 9:15, ready to escort me to the venue. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we walked through the hotel corridors. "Ready," I said, and meant it. The main auditorium was larger than I'd imagined, with tiered seating that stretched toward a ceiling decorated with intricate moldings. As we entered through the speaker's entrance, I could see hundreds of researchers finding their seats, the low hum of anticipatory conversation filling the space. A conference organizer fitted me with a wireless microphone and reviewed the presentation timing. 45 minutes for the talk, 15 minutes for questions. The slides had been loaded into the system and tested twice. Everything was ready. As I waited in the wings, watching the auditorium fill to capacity, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The late nights of coding, the rejection letters, the moment of decision in Marcus's office when I'd chosen to build something new rather than accept my assigned place in someone else's vision. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been necessary. Dr. Morrison took the stage to introduce me, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system as she outlined my background and achievements. I listened to her describe my work with a mixture of pride and surreal really belief. This happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," she concluded, "please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Chen." The applause was warm and sustained as I walked across the stage, feeling the weight of 3,000 pairs of eyes focused on my every movement. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at an audience filled with the world's leading experts in artificial intelligence. For just a moment, I allowed myself to remember that night at the Metropolitan Ballroom. The humiliation, the dismissal, the casual cruelty of people who couldn't imagine that innovation might emerge from unexpected places. Then I smiled, opened my presentation, and began to speak. 3 years ago, I was debugging code at 3 in the morning while other people took credit for the algorithms I'd built. Today, I want to show you what becomes possible when we stop accepting limitations on where breakthrough discoveries can come from. The auditorium fell completely silent, and I knew I had their attention. The presentation screen behind me illuminated with the first slide, showing a simple diagram of traditional neural network architecture alongside my adaptive neural evolution framework. The contrast was stark, like comparing a bicycle to a spacecraft. What you're seeing here represents 15 years of incremental improvements, I said, gesturing to the traditional model, versus a complete reimagining of how artificial intelligence can learn and grow. I clicked to the next slide, revealing real-time performance metrics from my agricultural client. Gasps echoed through the auditorium as the numbers appeared. 94% accuracy in crop yield prediction during unprecedented weather patterns. Systems that identified environmental indicators no human researcher had considered relevant. This isn't just better pattern recognition, I continued, my voice gaining strength as I hit my stride. This is artificial intelligence developing genuine intuition, learning to think in ways we never taught it to think. The audience leaned forward collectively, phones and tablets emerging as researchers began capturing my slides. I could see faces in the front rows, expressions shifting from polite interest to focused fascination. Dr. Amanda Foster sat 3 rows back, the cocktail napkin from last night's conversation visible on her lap. She was furiously taking notes, probably already envisioning how these principles could transform her climate modeling work. The breakthrough came from questioning a fundamental assumption, I said, advancing to a slide showing comparative learning curves. Everyone assumes AI needs extensive training datasets to achieve competence. But what if we could build systems that learn from experience the way humans do, developing new frameworks for understanding as they encounter novel problems? A hand shot up in the audience. Dr. Harrison Webb from Stanford, whose papers on neural plasticity I'd studied extensively during my self-education phase. Dr. Chen, the implications you're suggesting would require computational resources beyond what most institutions can access. How do you achieve these results without massive server farms? I smiled, having anticipated this question. That's the beauty of evolutionary algorithms. Instead of brute force processing, the system develops efficiency through iteration. It learns not just what to think, but how to think more effectively. The next 20 minutes flew by as I demonstrated live examples of adaptive neural evolution in action. The system analyzing supply chain data in real time, identifying optimization opportunities that traditional AI missed entirely. Financial models adapting to market volatility without human intervention. Healthcare diagnostics, discovering symptom correlations that had eluded medical researchers for decades. Each demonstration drew murmurs of amazement from the audience. These weren't theoretical possibilities, but proven applications. Systems already operating in the real world and delivering results that bordered on miraculous. The question isn't whether this technology works, I said, clicking to a slide showing adoption rates across my client base. The question is what becomes possible when we stop limiting artificial intelligence to human-designed thinking patterns. Near the back of the auditorium, I spotted Marcus Wellington. He sat alone, no longer checking his phone, his attention completely focused on my presentation. When our eyes met briefly, he nodded with what looked like genuine acknowledgement. The moment felt significant not because of his approval, but because his opinion no longer mattered to my sense of professional worth. I had found validation in places that truly counted, from peers who understood the depth of what I'd accomplished. The most exciting applications are still emerging, I continued, advancing to case studies from my recent consulting work. Last month, a renewable energy company used this system to optimize power grid distribution across 3 states. The AI didn't just improve efficiency, it developed entirely new load balancing strategies that their human engineers are still trying to understand. Dr. Morrison caught my eye from the side of the stage, tapping her watch subtly. 15 minutes remaining. I nodded and moved toward the culmination of my presentation. But here's what I want you to remember as you leave this conference, I said, my voice carrying to the back rows of the packed auditorium. Innovation doesn't require permission from established institutions. Breakthrough discoveries don't follow predictable paths through prestigious programs and traditional career trajectories. The slide behind me changed to show my journey timeline. 5 years as an invisible programmer, 18 months of nights and weekends building revolutionary technology, 8 months of proving it worked in the real world. Every algorithm I've shown you today was developed in my studio apartment, using equipment I bought with my savings, working alone because no one believed what I was trying to build was possible. Scattered applause began in the middle rows, spreading through the auditorium like ripples across water. But I wasn't finished yet. The person who will create the next breakthrough in artificial intelligence might be sitting in this room right now. But they might also be debugging code at 3 in the morning in a city you've never heard of, teaching themselves advanced mathematics through online courses, building solutions to problems that established researchers haven't recognized yet. The applause grew stronger, more sustained. I could see younger researchers throughout the audience sitting straighter, their expressions brightening with possibility. Don't wait for someone else to give you permission to innovate. Don't accept limitations on where transformative ideas can come from. The future of artificial intelligence will be built by people who refuse to stay invisible. The standing ovation began before I'd even finished my final sentence, 3,000 researchers rising to their feet in acknowledgement of what they'd just witnessed. As the applause thundered through the Vienna auditorium, I thought about that trembling woman in the Metropolitan Ballroom who believed her worth was determined by other people's recognition. She was wrong. Your value isn't measured by who notices your contributions or whose name appears on the patents. It's determined by the problems you solve, the barriers you break, the impossible things you make possible when everyone else says they can't be done. 3 years ago, Marcus Wellington laughed at my ambitions and told a room full of investors that I didn't understand real innovation. Today, those same principles I developed alone in my apartment are reshaping how the world's leading researchers think about artificial intelligence. But the real victory isn't standing on this stage or seeing my name in bold letters on conference programs. It's knowing that somewhere out there, another invisible programmer is watching this presentation and realizing they don't have to wait for permission to change the world. Your breakthrough is waiting. The only question is whether you'll have the courage to build it. If this story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their ideas matter, regardless of where they come from. Sometimes the most revolutionary innovations emerge from the most unexpected places. The next one might be yours.